You talked about the presidency, Congress. You didn't mention the Supreme Court. Now, does it matter at all in the evolution or not of the international liberation?
I think I did mention the court, actually. What I said is that, or I said the judiciary is actually, what is remarkable about the judiciary is that they've by and large shown extreme deference to the president when it comes to issues of national security. And this goes, back to court cases from, I think, Curtis Wright v. the United States on, in which the president is declared to be the sort of sole authority in foreign affairs. But I think even in the venue of the Trump administration, you've seen the court defer to the executive rather than the legislative branch. The most obvious being the travel ban that was announced, that was instituted in 2017. I think you also saw it with the transgender ban in the military. In both instances, these are instances in which you could argue it was not entirely clear the president had that authority, but essentially the court said, we're not going to intervene on this.
So if the internal order is the thing that's changing, but not really a fundamental change, just a shift within it, we're talking about the kind of mirroring with the new institutions that are out there. Could you address your thoughts on what the first order implications would be, your first principle implications of just allowing the shift of hegemony in the Indo-PACOM AOR, or maybe just the PACOM AOR, to China?
So a few things. First of all, I need to use the caveat of I barely know what PACOM AOR means. So, we're at the limits of my, I know what it means, but we're at the limits of my competency in terms of talking about the security realm. And indeed, my area of expertise is primarily political economy, and that's in some ways the sort of animating aspect of this. There is no denying that if you were to cede to China sort of hegemony on that issue, I think two things. I guess I would have two thoughts on this. The first is that no transition is going to be smooth. And so, honestly, what concerns me is not the premise that there would be a transition, but rather that would be the flashpoint for a larger war. The erosion, and this is something that's concerned me, is ironically, if the Trump administration were to succeed, you'd see erosion of economic interdependence between the United States and China. That is exactly the kind of thing that suddenly makes war more conceivable. You could argue there have been three breaks traditionally on a great power war in the sort of last 50 years, right? The first was the existence of multilateral institutions that sort of tamp down conflicts from potentially escalating to becoming great power wars. The second was economic interdependence that recognized that the costs of actually engaging in war were far too great and that you didn't want to disrupt the system. And the third was nuclear weapons. You could argue potentially that 10 years from now you will have eviscerated the first two of those three breaks. So it winds up being, unfortunately, a really tough test for how well nuclear weapons actually constrains great power behavior. The second is, and the other reason is I think it would be messy, is that it's not just China that would be, U.S. withdrawal combined with China rise would cause some states to bandwagon with China. It would not cause all states to bandwagon with China. It certainly wouldn't cause India to do that. I seriously doubt it would cause Japan to do that. And so the interesting question would be, would you see, for lack of a way of putting it, an Indo-Pacific strategy without the United States? And that we've now reached the limits of my competency on that question.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with Michael Beckley's new book, Unrivaled, which makes pretty much...
He's my colleague at Tufts. I hope I'm worried.
Well, I forgot that. That's right. So the argument you're making is markedly similar to his, that American structural power is likely to continue, at least for the indefinite future. Except I wonder if some of the choices that are being currently made by this administration can undermine the assumptions that you and Beckley seem to make.
Yeah, so you can argue, how do I put this? The great thing about the Trump administration is that it's the mother of all natural experiments when it comes to testing, our theories about how the world works. And in some ways, the question, for the administration is it actually possible to push on some of these structural pillars of power so hard that they wind up buckling well before they should. So one example of this is, in fact, the U.S. weaponization of the dollar in terms of financial statecraft to try to sanction Iran or to try to push on other actors. And by the way they're doing this is not by just pressuring Iran. They're forcing European allies and others to, have to adhere to the sanctions. So yeah, this is a concern. There's no denying this. This is the one area, however, where you can argue that the difference between 2 and 6 years makes a difference here. It would be possible for the next Democrat is unlikely, or the next Democratic successor to Trump is highly unlikely to stress test that system nearly as much as Trump is. But the question is going to be whether or not you are now going to see an increase in hedging strategies, not just by countries like China, but rather by the European Union. The creation of Instex, for example, this sort of workaround of U.S. sanctions on Iran, is interesting because it actually highlights the degree to which you're seeing a lot of these mechanisms now being put into place, not just by the European Union, also by India in terms of its trade with Iran, by China in terms of CIPS, by Russia in terms of its payment systems. Now, each of these in and of themselves doesn't amount to much. And it would be extremely costly to move, let's say, away from the dollar, even now. But again, this is where the natural experiment comes in. 6 more years of Trump deciding that he loves tariffs and that he's going to, push apply maximum pressure campaigns against anyone would potentially be enough to cause a rupture in the system. So yeah, do I think it's possible that Beckley is overly optimistic? I absolutely think it's possible. I think the other thing that we don't talk about all that much, which is an interesting consideration, is the sort of U.S. fiscal picture. You can argue that on the one hand, what we've learned in the United States is that the tolerance for the issuance of U.S. debt is much higher than people thought it was 10 years ago. There were a lot of debt hawks in 2009, 2010, 2011. Austerity folks claiming we had to get our budget in order, otherwise, there would be chaos. They proved to be wrong. But we're now running trillion-dollar deficits in an economy at about 3.6% unemployment. What terrifies me is not the trillion-dollar deficits now. It'll be the size of the deficit if the U.S. ever enters another recession. And someone's got to buy all that debt at some point. And I don't know what happens at that moment.
I agree with you, certainly, as what we've observed about this trend of Congress ceding ever more responsibility in foreign policy to the White House, with one exception, which is really curious, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this. It seems like just before every NATO summit, Congress does have a meeting, and they do seem to arrive at some sort of joint declaration with respect to NATO. And I'm wondering what you think might explain that. Thanks.
Because Congress loves joint declarations. Joint declaration is awesome for Congress. You're expressing a joint declaration means you are demonstrating your solidarity with an institution and taking no responsibility whatsoever for properly funding it or doing anything necessarily that would be politically controversial. There are 2 things that Congress loves to do when it comes to foreign policy that we'll still do. First is joint declarations that are symbolic acts, and the second are sanctions. They love sanctions because sanctions are the sweet spot for foreign policy. It's more than doing nothing, but it's not actually declaring war or taking any responsibility. It's just sort of showing that you've done something. So, it's one of those, and the reason why they're perfectly willing to do it for NATO is that NATO is still resoundingly popular in the United States. This is where Trump, whenever he complains about other countries not paying enough for NATO or what have you, frankly, this doesn't resonate all that much in the United States. I mean, there's the occasional sort of resentment or question about whether other countries should be doing, paying their fair share. That's a sort of great line that you can use. But even the people who grumble about this don't want to rupture NATO, as a way of sort of striking a better bargain. And again, it's worth noting that this is one of the few areas where Trump has actually demonstrated restraint. There's been enough press coverage to suggest that he wants to do this, but he also recognizes that that would probably be a tweet too far, as it were. And so I think that's the issue there. And so, Congress passing these joint resolutions is a way to try to occasionally signal to the president there are red lines that if you cross, we will actually, even though it's the last thing we want to do, take action.
It's very clear to me that you're a liberal internationalist. You've done a fine job of attacking President Trump and his policies. I would just ask that you take a few moments now and look in the mirror and, and explain the flaws, if you see any, in the liberal internationalist ideology or agenda. Because I don't see you taking, or IR, or the colleagues, or the so-called experts, taking any responsibility for the state of the world, and that you continually deflect. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on what you think are the core failings of the profession and the, and the experts. You don't have to go back very far in history, but just pick a period. And explain to me how the experts have failed.
So, the core failings of my profession. I'm glad to have the next hour to go at length on this topic. I would say there are two failings, two principles. Well, I would make one clarification and then talk about the two failings. The clarification is, when you talk about my profession, be very careful here, because most academic, to claim that most international relations scholars are liberal internationalists is, I think, a lazy generalization. I don't think it's true. I think there are a fair number of realists. I think there are a fair number of constructivists. There are even, liberal institutionalists, but that's not necessarily the same as liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism is the idea in the United States of sort of marrying U.S. hegemonic power with acting multilaterally, and trying to sort of channel that power through structures that manage to avoid triggering balancing. Now, that said, what are the two failures? Three failures. The first failure was a wholehearted acceptance that globalization could only generate winners as opposed to losers. The idea that economic globalization, was the situation where it was a rising boat, that would lift all tides, and that it would make everyone richer, and we didn't have to worry about the distributional consequences of this. And that was clearly wrong. Again, I want to be very clear what I'm saying here. Globalization was still the right policy. It generated significant, increases. It led to the, most significant and most massive reduction in global extreme poverty in world history. That is not a minor thing. Nonetheless, it also caused significant redistributions within particularly the developed world. And and you can argue that in particular the United States lacked the redistributive mechanisms to ensure that the losers were at least as well off as they were before. And so that, and furthermore, proved to be genuinely asleep at the wheel as you saw the emergence of bubbles in the mid-2000s that wound up leading to the 2008 financial crisis. So they were far too complacent about globalization. The second, I think, is that there was a hubris born out of the 1990s that U.S. military power could solve everything. It is worth remembering that in the 1990s, the U.S. seemed able to, let's say, stop the Balkan Wars in Bosnia and Kosovo with a few short, limited interventions. And Afghanistan, after 2001, seemed to fall relatively quickly after some original doubts. There was a belief, I think, that U.S. military power could be generally used to quickly solve problems that were deemed potentially problematic. That is clearly proven to be false. This is a concern not just by sort of neoconservatives or the Bush administration who advocated this, but also by the silent and occasionally not so silent support of liberal internationalists who thought after 2001 that invading Iraq might potentially be a good idea. The third thing that I think, and the third failure of liberal internationalism, although you're not going to want me to say this, this is sort of it's like Hobbes claiming that the problem with the Leviathan is that it's not powerful enough. I do think that liberal internationalists failed to sell the successes that they actually were responsible for, which is you can argue that the post-Cold War era is now looked at as, Trump running in 2016 saying, what a disaster we've inherited, what the hell have you got to lose, why don't you elect me? And I look back at the post-Cold War period and you saw a persistent and steady decline in the number of armed conflicts, a significant increase in the standard of living across the board. These are not minor things. And in some ways, you could argue that what experts failed to do was connect why these sorts of, why the liberal international order does on occasion, in fact, affect pocketbook issues. And here I do want to thank Donald Trump, because if there is one thing Donald Trump has done and done remarkably well, it is demonstrate the cost of disrupting the liberal international order. You are now seeing Americans not necessarily thrilled about the fact that they've got to pay a lot more to get their washing machines, that they might have to pay a lot more to get cars, that they're going to have to pay a lot more to get agricultural produce if the Mexican tariffs ever actually go into place. They're now actually understanding the degree to which even the United States, which is relatively insulated compared to an awful lot of smaller states, but the degree to which the United States is actually relying on the rest of the world for a fair amount of its economic affluence. And I think there's a degree to which proponents or liberal internationalists took that for granted and didn't realize that you have to continually and repeatedly make that case.
Can I ask you to follow along there and talk about something explicitly? You mentioned it implicitly, and that is what seems to be part of the restructuring here, the revisionism from within, that is mirrored from without, and that is the efforts of the Trump administration to decouple economically from China, a move that appears, at least on the surface, to be mirrored by the Chinese themselves. And I'm just wondering what you think the implications, the medium-term implications, are of a progressive decoupling of that interdependence between the U.S. and China.
So I guess I would say three things on this. The first is that while there's no denying that both sides seem interested in decoupling, and there's been a lot of moves in that direction, I also think it's dangerous to exaggerate the amount of decoupling that's taken place. Yes, trade between the two countries has fallen, but there's still an awful lot of, sort of tendons connecting the two economies. And I don't necessarily think that even 2 more years of this is going to really sever it. I think the interesting thing is when you will start seeing China taking moves, and they've made noises about this, but when you start seeing China, for example, deciding to dump U.S. debt, when will you start seeing China start to essentially encourage consumer boycotts? That's actually the thing that I've been most surprised by. I've been genuinely surprised by the degree to which the Chinese government has refrained from doing to the United States what it did do to South Korea, when South Korea decided to impose the THAAD system. So there is still restraint going on. I don't think the idea that you're automatically shifting towards a decoupling is sort of foreordained, and I want to point that out. That said, if it does happen, I think there are 2 significant effects. The first is you will see a global recession, because even now the sort of degree of economic uncertainty, between the two sides, that's a great way to turn off investment by both actors. If you're a Western multinational, why would you invest in a global supply chain now if you have no idea what the political environment or the regulatory environment is going to look like for the next 4 to 5 years? And similarly for China, by the way. As someone who does research on sanctions, the one way in which the sort of primary mechanism through which sanctions will debilitate an economy is by drying up both foreign direct investment and domestic investment as well, because it hates uncertainty. The other thing, and as I said before, I think if it does continue, and if you have a reduction of economic interdependence between these 2 large states, in some ways it also partially depends on what the other actors in the region decide to do. Are they forced to choose between one or the other? Or are they allowed to essentially all function like Yugoslavia during the Cold War? And I think the jury's still out on that. I don't think we know how that would play out. But also weakening interdependence, again, as I said, it removes a brake that would otherwise stop, a great power conflict from escalating into actual great power war.
So my question is concerning the flip-flopping and the centralization of presidential power. Mm-hmm. So if I understand your argument correctly, as the president has more and more power, and it flip-flops from Democrat to Republican, there's no consistency, and you can't really have a good strategy. So I just wanted to look at it from the Canadian lens. As we have a prime minister with a majority, he has more or less absolute power until the following election to sign trade deals, appoint senators, a lot of power. So would it be your argument that we cannot, in the current form, have a consistent strategy, or is there ways to remedy that?
So I guess the answer is that it's not just that the president has accumulated more power in terms of foreign policy. It is also that to be a Democrat or Republican now is not the same thing as to have been a Democrat or Republican in 1948. And so the problem is that, you know, you have parties that are also so much further apart, and also parties that are frankly willing to make foreign policy a plaything of domestic politics in a way in which I don't think that was necessarily the case even potentially 10 years ago. That it winds up leading to that kind of flip-flop. I apologize profusely. I am simply going to punt on the Canada question because you all here know far more about Canadian politics than I do, and I'm not going to speculate. You know, I'm not going to comment on that which I know nothing about. You know, that's how expertise get devalued.
Just a quick one again, if I may. We tend to look at China in kind of a monolithical way, and I think we exaggerate the way we approach it. And you mentioned that Xi Jinping himself now starts recognizing when there are errors, and that it becomes as a great surprise. The development of China economically has been so fast that I wonder whether the Chinese themselves really know exactly where they want to go, even though they have very clear leadership and all that, because the change over the last 15 years was so immense. Is there a sense that they're still searching themselves where they want to be over and beyond the security dimension, or not?
Well, I would say the following. I think the Chinese very much know clearly where they want to go, which is they want to have the same position in the world that they had in 1650. Which is they want to return to being the most powerful actor in the world because, as they see it, this is their historical birthright, and this is the way things have been throughout much of history, excepted, you know, the 19th and 20th centuries. So, I think where they want to go is pretty clear. Where I do think they're not clear about is how to get there, and I think that's where they've been willing to be more experimental, where they've been willing to engage in trial and error, you know, insert whatever Deng Xiaoping proverb you want. What is it? Crossing the river to feel the stones. I think that's the one that I was going to use. And where they've been willing to sort of engage in ever more examples of trial and error to see what they can do. And I think in some ways that's the best explanation for sort of China's push, sort of multilateral push outside of the Bretton Woods system. And again, one of the striking things about this is that, you know, you can argue that China, for example, you know, was all in on the BRICS Development Bank, and, you know, we understood that, and, like, you know, the BRICS partners were perfectly happy about that. And then China launched the AIIB, which took the BRICS partners, I think, completely by surprise. They were not expecting this. And the AIIB is clearly much more of a Chinese-run institution than the BRICS was. And then just as the AIIB thing ends, BRI starts up. And so even the people involved in the AIIB are like, wait a minute, you know, those at least were multilateral. BRI looks very, very different. And again, I think it's where they're trying to see what works, what doesn't, and also what caters, you know, what works for particular domestic constituencies within China. So I think they know where they want to go. I think they're not entirely sure how they're going to get there. And I think also, as I said, China's greatest strength strategically is willing to recognize past mistakes, at least internally, I think.
If you were going to go through a revisionist method, first thing you would have changed is the information and ideas.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the relative vulnerabilities for either internal or external revisionists in exploiting social media to start to affect that change, where states have less influence over the messaging that comes over those means?
I think what I'm going to say is not entirely shocking, which is to say that there is no denying that societies that rely a lot on social media, you know, increase their potential vulnerability to external actors trying to, you know, sow distrust or, you know, feed suspicion of what we would consider legitimate sources of information. That said, and I want to stress this, while I think we now have documented evidence, for example, of the role that Russia played in the 2016 election, they certainly weaponized information, they were also pushing on an open door, which is to say that it's not just, the social media is the mechanism. You know, the internet is the mechanism through which this is all done. The driver of it was, in fact, increased amounts of political polarization. It was the fact that you had, you know, partisans on both sides entirely willing to believe that the other side was capable of, you know, perfidy or what have you. I think that this hit home for me, I think, it was a Wall Street Journal story back in 2017 in which some, you know, Republican GOP political operatives in Florida were asked about, you know, would they cooperate with Russia against the Democrats? And their response was, yeah, of course we would, you know, because the Democrats are the real enemy. which is a terrifying prospect. You know, Carl Schmitt, in The Concept of the Political, says that the fundamental, fact of politics is defining the friend and defining the enemy. What I am concerned about in the United States is that the Schmittian defense, or the Schmittian definition of the political has shifted, that the enemy is no longer thought of as external, it might be thought of as internal.